as you can see, there is a lot to discuss. I've tried to break it down to make it clear into 5 main points. I want to look at the relationship between the old and new law and then each one of the antitheses. So let's work through those one at a time. Number 1, Jesus begins by saying, this section by saying that he has not come to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them. Now, the standard Jewish name for the scriptures at this time was the law and the prophets. That's how they referred to the 2 major portions of the Old Testament. This was a common name. They didn't use the word the Bible yet, but that's what Jesus means here. He's referring to the Jewish scriptures. So what he's saying here is that everything he's about to say when he's going to set his teaching in opposition to Moses isn't intended to abolish the law of Moses. It's intended to fulfill the law of Moses. And the Greek word there, fulfill, pleroo, literally means to make complete, to bring to perfection. So what Jesus is revealing here is he's showing us that there are aspects of the Old Testament that are not perfect. In other words, they're not what God ultimately wants for his people. They are, as we saw last time, like the 10 Commandments that were given at the bottom of the mountain, right? They were a standard of righteousness, but they're a lower standard of righteousness. Here, Jesus wants to perfect that law of righteousness and bring the disciples up to the top of the mountain, where he's going to give them the new law, the gospel, that's not going to break the old law, but it's going to transform it, it's going to transfigure it, it's going to transcend it, and bring them up to the kingdom, the level of the kingdom of heaven. That's what he means when he says that their righteousness must exceed that of the Pharisees. That if it's not greater than that of the Pharisees, which were at the level of the law of Moses at the bottom of the mountain, they'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. Okay, so this stands in stark contrast to a temptation that has been throughout the history of the church to reject the Old Testament. This goes back to a heretic known as Marcion, who regarded the Old Testament as coming from a different God, a lesser God than the New Testament. The church has always rejected that because Jesus rejected it. And he made very clear his mission, the new law, is fulfilling the Old Testament, not abolishing it. In fact, when he says there, and if you look at that verse, he says, not an iota, not a dot will pass away until it's all accomplished. The words there for iota, he's referring to the Hebrew letter yod, which is a Y. It's the smallest letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And then when he says, not a, let's see other translation it uses here, not an iota, not a dot will pass. The dot is a reference to one of the little, it's called horn, a chariah in Greek. It's just like a little tiny extra mark on the edge of certain letters. So what Jesus is basically saying is, not the smallest Hebrew letter and not even the smallest part of a Hebrew letter from the law and the prophets is going to pass away. It's all inspired and it's all going to be accomplished. It's all going to be fulfilled. He's going to be the one to fulfill it, of course. All right, so that's the main point. He's basically beginning with a caveat about the antitheses that he's going to give are not undoing the law. They're fulfilling it. All right, with that said, let's work through each one of them. The first antithesis has to do with anger and insults. And basically what Jesus is teaching in this one is a contrast. In the Old Testament, the book of Exodus, chapter 20, the 10 Commandments, Moses forbade murder, right? You shall not kill. In the new law of the gospel, Jesus forbids anger and insults. So he goes far beyond murder to forbid anger and insults. And it's interesting, in the passage here that I read, it says, whoever insults his brother. That's the Revised Standard Version. But literally in the Greek, it says, whoever says raka to his brother shall be liable to the council. What does that mean? Well, we're not really quite sure. Raka was an Aramaic word that seems to have meant something like brainless or numbskull or empty head or worthless. It was just an insult to say that someone was an idiot, right? And you can see that in the next insult too, because when Jesus says, whoever says you fool, the Greek word there is more. We get the word moron in English from that. So these are insults that we would make against someone out of anger, right? Where you would, how would we say, disrespect them and deride them because of the emotion of anger. It'd be like a curse. And so in any case, what Jesus says is, anyone who says you fool shall be liable Now, the RSV says, to the hell of fire. This was a little tricky. The New American Bible is better on this. It says liable to the Gehenna of fire. And Gehenna is, in fact, the word in Greek. It's a word that comes from the expression meaning the valley of Hinnom. Hinnom was a valley to the east of Jerusalem where many sacrifices, human sacrifices, and pagan cults had once dwelt and been carried out. And so it was regarded as defiled, and it was basically a garbage dump, and they would burn trash and dung and other things there. So it was always on fire, it was reeking and smoking, and it became a kind of earthly image for the realm of the damned, for the realm of spiritual fire and spiritual punishments. And so what Jesus is doing here is making clear that not only is murder a sin, but anger and insults, even they are sinful and are liable to judgment. Now, I don't have time to go into this in depth in this video, but one thing I think it is important to point out here is that in a first century Jewish context, Gehenna was not simply a realm of that was populated by the fire of the damned. Rabbis also would talk about Gehenna as a place of purification through fire for people whose sins were less serious or less weighty, and that it could be a temporary place of punishment before someone would enter into the life of the world to come. It'd be, in other words, Gehenna was also in the Jewish tradition a kind of a name for what we would call purgatory as Catholics, a place of spiritual purification that was temporary rather than permanent. And I think that you can see that in this passage here. I think that's what Jesus means, although there's some debate about this in the tradition between the different church fathers. When he talks about, he also describes going to prison. And he says, you'll never get out until you've paid the last penny. Well, if he was just talking about eternal damnation, it really wouldn't make sense for him to say that because the damned never get out of the prison of hell. But it does make sense if he's talking about what we call purgatory, because this would mean that a place of punishment where you would pay the debt of lesser sins, like anger and insults, and that you will not enter into the kingdom until you've paid the last penny for the debt of those sins. In any case, as Augustine pointed out in his commentary on this, he says this, we need to be clear that in this antithesis, Jesus is not forbidding the emotion of anger, like the involuntary movement of anger that we all experience when something bad happens. What he is forbidding, though, is consent to that anger, consent to that emotion, which would lead to us acting on the anger, either by insulting someone else or cursing someone else in outbursts and insults, to say nothing of striking someone else or murdering someone else, which is, of course, was what was forbidden by Moses. So what's Jesus doing here? He's not undoing the law against murder in the Old Testament. He's driving it much more deep into the human heart and getting to the root cause of murder, which is ultimately wrath and anger and ill will, a desire to hurt someone else because they've done something wrong or because they've hurt us or whatever may be the cause.